Hello, this is Tom from Never Center. I want to show you in this video some of the common tone curve adjustments that you might use in photos and the shapes that you'll see over and over again in tone curves that will help you get certain effects and adjustments that will come in useful over and over and over again. So this is the tone curve in Camera Bag, and this applies to all software that has curve controls. And we're using Camera Bag for this. And you'll see just the basics of a tone curve. What the curve represents, you can see I can adjust it by pulling around control points. And what this represents is along the bottom is how bright pixels are before I apply this curve. And from top to bottom on this graph is the brightness that they'll have afterwards. So for example, right now when the curve is just this default 45-degree line, that means that pixels that were before at brightness value 0 will still be brightness value 0. Pixels that were before at brightness value 50%, if I go up and see where the line is at, you can see it goes to 50% height there. And pixels that were brightness value 100% before will still be 100%. So if I pull this curve up here, for example, now you can see pixels before that were brightness value 50%, because I'm 50% along the way on this chart. If I go up, I can see now that there's 75% of the height of the way up. So that means that I've made those pixels that were 50% brightness now be 75% brightness. And so this is sort of one of the most basic adjustments you can make with this curve, is if you just pull it above that line, it's making all the pixels a little bit brighter. And you can see the darkest pixels still remain black and the lightest pixels still remain white, because both those are at their default positions, but everything in between is adjusted a little bit up. So the defaults sort of adjustment you can make with this is just exposure. And you can see as I move this line around a little bit, I'm adjusting sort of how much of that bringing the exposure down is applied to the darker areas of the image or the lighter areas of the image, depending on whether I'm pulling things down more on the left or the right of this chart. So you can mess around with those, and so any exposure slider that you'll see in software is basically doing this under the hood, and it's just using sort of a default way to adjust this curve. But when you do it manually with curves, you can add all these subtler adjustments in to get the exposure just how you like it. Now let me reset this. One of the other most common curves that you'll see is to increase contrast. And contrast is basically making the darkers darker, so I'm pulling down the left side of the graph, and the brights brighter, so I'm pulling up the right side of the graph. And so you can see, again, things that were before at 25% brightness, I've pulled that line down, so now they're about, maybe 20 or 18% brightness. And things that were before at 75% brightness, I pulled that line up, and now they're above 75% of the height on here, so it's more like 85% brightness. And that's how you get contrast. And so if I pull these down more and up more, that's like increasing the contrast. And basically any software, again, when you have a contrast slider, it's doing this under the hood. But when you do it with a curve, you can add more subtle adjustments so that most of the contrast is by making the darks darker, or like this, most of the contrast is achieved by making the brights brighter. And you can see another way to achieve contrast is by doing the opposite of this, which is to reduce contrast. And so when I pull up the left-hand side of the graph and pull down the right-hand side of the graph, I'm effectively reducing the contrast. And I'll just toggle the original on and off. You can see that when this curve is applied, it's making it more close to the whole image being gray. Another popular look that is currently very popular is sort of a matte look, where it's achieved by pulling the left side of this graph up so that the blacks that were before fully black are no longer fully black. They're more like a gray. And so that's just achieved by pulling this up, because you can see what was before at 0% or black is now up and this, you can vary this, but a lot of people like it sort of very close but not all the way. And so that will give you that popular matte look. And a lot of times, if you do this, it can make an image look washed out. And so what people will do a lot is then add in a little bit of contrast by sort of adding one of those S-curves to this after they pull up the shadows like that. And so by adding in an S-curve and lifting up that left side, it makes it still look contrasty, but as you can see in the histogram here, the blackest pixels before are now all the way up there. And there's a lot of variation you can get by moving these around just a little bit to get exactly the look that you want, but this is a very popular look currently. And let me just show this on some other photos also. I'm just arrowing through photos here, and I'll toggle between the original and the adjusted, and you can see sort of the effect that it's applying on that. A lot of times you'll want to make the brights brighter or the darks darker. So for example, in this photo, you can see, looking at the histogram, I'll make this really big right now. The brightest brights are not coming all the way to the right end of the histogram. So the brightest brights are something like 95% of full brightness. So nothing in this image is full on white. To fix that using a tone curve, you would just grab the upper right hand corner and pull this to the right. And you can see, as I did that in the histogram, it's basically just pulling all the values in the chart over to the right. And so you can pull it over until the brightest brights are right at a white, if that's what you want. And so you can see, if I did this, like, say 50% of the way over here, what this graph again is saying is that anything that was above 50% brightness before is now pegged up to 100% brightness. So half the pixels in this image, brightness-wise, are now fully white, and so that's why you can see everything is sort of blown out, as they call it. But more often you'd want to just do it a little bit of the ways, and it depends on what your photo looks like, how much you want to do that. Let me see if I can find a photo here that needs the darks adjusted. Actually, this beach photo, you can see here the blacks are not fully black based on this histogram. And so putting a tone curve in again, we'll do the same thing that we did with the upper right hand side, but we'll do it now with the shadows, where if I pull this to the right, it's pulling that histogram over to the left, and it's making the blacks be fully black. And again, let me just do an extreme example of this. Say I pull it over here, I've got it, well, let's do it 50%. So now I'm saying everything that was 50% bright or darker than that before, now I've pulled it all the way down so it's fully black. And so that's why a lot of pixels in this image now are full on black. But usually it wouldn't require something quite so extreme. But that's how you do that. Now I'm going to show you how to lift just the shadowy areas in a photo, but without making the blacks not be fully black. And so often they'll call this just adjusting the shadows. And so with a tone curve, how you do this, I'll put a point in the middle so that I won't be adjusting the top half of this or the brighter values. I just want to make the dark portions of this image lighter. And so to do that, with that point in the middle, then I can just lift this lower end of the curve. And maybe I'll pull this down a little bit more so it's not adjusting any of the top half of the brighter values. But a curve like this, where you've just got this left-hand side coming up above it, that's how you lift the shadows. And so you can see on my histogram, I'm not pulling the darkest darks over at all. I'm just boosting them, sort of nudging them over while leaving the black still fully black. And that's how you get something like this, where it may be too shadowy before, to lift those shadows. And if I do the opposite, this is basically just lowering and raising the shadows. And I can do the converse of that over on the right hand side of this let me find a different image that, let's use this one. If I want to adjust the highlights, I would then again put a control point in the middle of this curve so that I'm just working with the right hand side of this curve. You can see how this is just adjusting the brighter portions of the image and either making the brights brighter or the brights darker, and this is how you would adjust the highlights. And then if you want to control highlights, midtones, and shadows, so I can put 3 control points on here. Now I control the midtones with this middle one, and that's sort of the parts that are mid-bright. I control the highlights with this one. I don't have to just move it up and down. I can move it left or right. And then I control the shadows with this one. And so it can be pretty common to have 3 control points in here. And then I can lift the midtones, lower the shadows or raise the shadows, and lower or raise the highlights to get the look that I want. So those are the basics of tone curves and the shapes that you'll commonly see and use. Hope this video has been helpful. Thanks.